I never imagined my own flesh and blood would shut me out of her life, but when Eleonora banned me from seeing my grandchildren, I realized just how far things had fallen apart. The riverside property that had been in our family for generations, the same house where she'd been living rent-free for 7 years, suddenly felt like the last card I had left to play. Was I wrong to sell it? Maybe. But after what happened, I couldn't let things continue as they were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I've always believed that family comes before anything else. When my husband Thaddeus and I worked our way up from nothing, building our architecture firm from a tiny office above a laundromat to one of the most respected names in Meridian Bay, we promised each other that our success would never come at the expense of our children. Our daughter Eleonora was our greatest joy, brilliant, creative, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room. When she graduated from design school with honors, Thaddeus and I were bursting with pride. She was 24, ambitious, and already turning heads in the industry with her innovative designs combining sustainability with luxury. To celebrate her achievement and give her a solid foundation for her future, we made what I thought was the most generous gesture possible. We signed over our cherished riverside property to her name. The Cypress Haven property wasn't just any house. It was a historic 3-bedroom craftsman that Thaddeus had lovingly restored himself, nestled on 2 acres of riverfront land with century-old oak trees and a private dock. The property had been in my family for 4 generations, survived 2 floods and a hurricane, and held memories of every Christmas, every birthday celebration, every milestone in our family's history. "Mom, this is too much," Eleonora had whispered when we handed her the deed, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't accept this." "Nonsense," I'd said, squeezing her hand. "Who better to care for our family's legacy than you? The house needs someone who appreciates its history. Besides, you'll need the space someday when you have a family of your own." Thaddeus had nodded in agreement. "Just promise us you'll keep the spirit of the place alive. Those walls have witnessed a century of love and laughter. Keep that tradition going." Eleonora had promised, of course. She moved in immediately, transforming the place with her unique design aesthetic while respectfully preserving its historical elements. For those first few years, everything was perfect. She invited us over for Sunday dinners, sent us photos of her renovations, and seemed to truly understand the significance of what we'd given her. Then she met Zephyr Blackwood at an industry conference in Portland. Within 6 months, they were engaged. I still remember the first time she brought him to dinner at Cypress Haven. Zephyr arrived in a vintage Porsche that seemed deliberately chosen to draw attention, wearing an outfit that cost more than most people's monthly salary but somehow managed to look careless. He had the kind of practiced charm that never quite reaches the eyes, complimenting my cooking while barely touching his food, admiring Thaddeus's craftsmanship while subtly suggesting how he might have done things differently. "Zephyr works in venture capital," Eleonora had explained, her voice tinged with a defensiveness I hadn't heard before. "He specializes in tech startups and sustainable innovation." Throughout dinner, he dominated the conversation with stories of deals he'd closed, celebrities he'd met, places he'd traveled. Each anecdote seemed calibrated to impress, to establish his superiority in some way. But what struck me most was how Eleonora seemed to shrink in his presence. Her usual confidence and vivacity dimmed like a light switched to its lowest setting. When Zephyr excused himself to take a call, the 3rd of the evening, Thaddeus and I exchanged glances across the table. My husband has always been slow to judge, preferring to see the best in people, but even he couldn't hide his concern. "He seems ambitious," Thaddeus offered carefully once Zephyr was out of earshot. Eleonora's response was immediate and defensive. "He's brilliant, Dad. You should see how he commands a room when he's pitching to investors. Everyone respects him." Respect is important, I agreed, choosing my words with care. But so is kindness. Does he make you happy, sweetheart? For just a moment, something flashed across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a question she wasn't ready to answer. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Of course he makes me happy, she'd replied, her voice steadier than her eyes. He challenges me to be better, to aim higher. Isn't that what you always taught me to look for in a partner? Before I could respond, Zephyr returned, tucking his phone into his pocket with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sorry about that. Potential 8-figure deal? Couldn't wait. He placed his hand possessively on Eleanora's shoulder. What did I miss? Nothing important, Eleanora had replied, and something in my heart had constricted at the dismissal. The engagement party was held at Cypress Haven 2 months later. Zephyr invited 50 guests, mostly his business associates and a few distant relatives, who filled our family home with unfamiliar voices and laughter that somehow lacked warmth. I noticed how Zephyr's parents, Marietta and Julian Blackwood, moved through the space with appraising eyes, as if mentally calculating its value. What a charming little place, Marietta had commented, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured around the living room. Of course, it needs updating, but there's potential. Zephyr tells me it's yours now, Eleanora. It was a gift from my parents, Eleanora had explained, glancing at me with a mixture of pride and defensiveness. Marietta's smile had tightened. How quaint. Julian gave Zephyr his first investment capital when he turned 21, $2 million to start his portfolio. We believe in setting our children up for success, not just sentimentality. The wedding planning moved at a whirlwind pace. Suddenly, Eleanora was talking about destination ceremonies in Santorini, custom gowns from designers I'd never heard of, and guest lists that included people she'd never mentioned before. When Thaddeus and I expressed concern about the extravagance and offered to contribute what we could, Zephyr had waved away our concerns. Marietta has connections with all the right vendors, he'd explained smoothly, and I want to give Eleanora the wedding she deserves. Don't worry about the cost. But something in his tone made me worry all the more, especially when, just 3 weeks before the wedding, Eleanora called in tears. Zephyr's investment fell through, she explained, her voice tight with stress. The startup he backed failed its final round of funding. Oh, sweetheart, I'd sympathized. These things happen in business. Perhaps you could scale back the wedding plans. There was a long pause before she responded. Actually, Zephyr wondered if you and Dad might be able to help, just temporarily. Another pause. He mentioned a loan against the architecture. Firm. The request felt like a physical blow. The firm was our life's work, our retirement security. Eleanora, that's not possible. We could help with a more modest celebration, but it's fine. She'd cut me off, her voice suddenly cold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Forget I asked. Zephyr will figure something out. He always does. The wedding proceeded as planned, though I never did find out where the money came from. What I do know is that something fundamental shifted in our relationship that day. When Eleanora returned from her honeymoon in the Maldives, she was different. More distant, more guarded, more firmly under Zephyr's influence. Within months, Sunday dinners became monthly, then quarterly, then rare special occasions. When I would call to check in, my conversations with Eleanora were increasingly interrupted by Zephyr's voice in the background, asking who she was talking to or reminding her of some appointment they couldn't miss. Then came the announcement that she was pregnant. My first grandchild was on the way, and despite my growing concerns about Zephyr's influence, I was ecstatic. Surely this new life would bring us all closer together, would remind Eleanora of the importance of family. For a brief time, It seemed I might be right. Eleonora invited me to doctor's appointments, asked my advice about nursery designs, even spent a weekend at our home sorting through her old baby clothes. But as her due date approached, Zephyr's presence became more controlling, more intrusive. Marietta has arranged for the best doula in the city, he informed me when I offered to be with Eleonora during the delivery. And we've decided we want the first 2 weeks to be just family. The implication was clear. I was no longer considered family. When little Aurelia was born, 7 pounds, 4 ounces of perfection with Eleonora's eyes and a dusting of dark hair, I wasn't called until she was already 6 hours old. My first visit was limited to 30 minutes, with Marietta Blackwood hovering the entire time, periodically removing the baby from my arms to check her temperature or adjust her swaddle. As Aurelia grew, my time with her was increasingly restricted, always supervised, always under the watchful eye of Zephyr or his mother. Eleonora seemed torn, occasionally attempting to advocate for more visits, but quickly backing down when Zephyr expressed disapproval. When Thaddeus fell ill with pneumonia during Aurelia's first winter, Eleonora didn't visit once, citing concerns about exposing the baby to germs. Instead, she sent impersonal text updates and flowers delivered by a service. Thaddeus, never one to complain, simply nodded when I told him, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. She's a mother now. He'd said weakly from his hospital bed, her child comes first, as it should be. But we both knew it was more than that. It wasn't just caution, it was exclusion, deliberate and painful. The real breaking point came years later, after Eleonora gave birth to twins, Orion and Lyra, a beautiful boy and girl who doubled our joy and doubled our heartbreak, as they felt even further from our reach than Aurelia had been. By then, Zephyr and Eleonora had established a pattern. They lived rent-free in our family home, contributed nothing to its upkeep or property taxes, which Thaddeus and I still paid despite the deed transfer, and effectively used the property as collateral for Zephyr's increasingly risky business ventures. Whenever I expressed concern about their financial decisions, about our limited access to our grandchildren, about how Eleonora seemed increasingly isolated from her old friends and colleagues, the response was swift and defensive. "You don't understand modern business," Zephyr would say dismissively, or modern parenting, for that matter. What I did understand was that my daughter was slipping away, and with her, my grandchildren. The final straw came on Aurelia's 4th birthday. We had been promised a visit, had bought gifts, baked her favorite chocolate cake with raspberry filling, decorated our home with balloons and streamers, only to receive a text message an hour before their expected arrival. Something came up. Can't make it today. Maybe next weekend. No explanation, no apology, just a casual dismissal of our feelings, our preparations, our place in their lives. When I called Eleonora, demanding to know what was so important that they had to cancel, it was Zephyr who answered her phone. Marietta arranged a photo shoot with Aurelia for her photography club, he explained, sounding irritated at having to justify their decision. It's important networking for my mother's social circle, you understand? But I didn't understand. Not anymore. And when I expressed as much, suggesting that perhaps they were taking advantage of our generosity while excluding us from their lives, Zephyr's response was chilling. "I think it's time we reevaluate your role in our children's lives," he said, coolly. "Your negativity and outdated views aren't the influence we want for them." That night, after crying on Thaddeus's shoulder for hours, I made a decision. If our family home, the property that had witnessed generations of love and laughter, was now being used as a weapon against us, perhaps it was time to remove that weapon from Zephyr's arsenal. What I didn't realize then was that my decision would uncover secrets Zephyr had been keeping from everyone, including my daughter. Secrets that would shake the foundations of their marriage and force Eleonora to confront the truth about the man she had married. Part 2. The Unraveling Truth. The very next morning, I called our family attorney, Vesper Montgomery, who had handled our affairs for over 20 years. I explained the situation without emotion, laying out the facts as clearly as I could manage, despite my breaking heart. "Let me understand," Vesper said, her voice carrying the measured calm that had guided us through many business challenges. "You gifted the property to Eleonora unconditionally, but you've continued to pay the property taxes, and now they've restricted your access to your grandchildren." "Yes," I confirmed. "The deed is in her name, but there was an unspoken understanding that it was meant to give her a foundation, not to exclude us from her life." Vesper was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her tapping her pen against her desk, a habit she had when deep in thought. "Legally, the property is hers, but there might be another approach," another tap of her pen. "Tell me, Marilyn, was the property ever used as collateral for any loans or business ventures?" That question triggered something in my memory. About a year earlier, Thaddeus had mentioned noticing unfamiliar paperwork on the dining room table. During one of our rare visits, documents he thought might be related to a mortgage or equity line. At the time, we'd assumed Eleonora and Zephyr were perhaps planning renovations. "I'm not certain," I admitted, "but it's possible." "With your permission, I'd like to have my associate run a title search on the property," Vesper suggested, just to clarify its current status. I agreed, and Vesper promised to call me back within a few days. When she did, her voice had an edge I'd rarely heard from the usually composed attorney. "Marilyn, I think you should come to the office. There's something you need to see." 2 hours later, Thaddeus and I sat across from Vesper as she spread several documents across her desk. What she revealed sent shockwaves through us both. The property had indeed been used as collateral, not once, but 3 times in the past 5 years. Zephyr had taken out a substantial equity line of credit shortly after the wedding, another larger loan after Aurelia's birth, and a third, even more substantial loan just 8 months ago. "The concerning part," Vesper explained gently, "is that all 3 loans were taken out in Eleonora's name, but the funds were directed to accounts that appear to be solely controlled by Zephyr. And based on these payment records, they're 3 months behind on the most recent loan." My hands trembled as I examined the documents. "Is Eleonora aware of these loans?" Vesper's expression was grave. "Her signature is on the paperwork, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what she was implying. It was possible, even likely, that Zephyr had manipulated Eleonora into signing documents she didn't fully understand or hadn't even read. "There's more," Vesper continued reluctantly. "I took the liberty of having my team do some preliminary research into Zephyr's business activities, given your concerns." She slid another folder across the desk. Inside were printouts of court records, news articles, and business filings that painted a disturbing picture. Zephyr Blackwood had been named in 2 lawsuits for investor fraud in the past decade, both settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. His much-touted venture, capital firm, existed largely on paper, with minimal assets and a concerning pattern of dissolved partnerships. Most disturbing of all was evidence suggesting that the business failure Zephyr had cited before the wedding, the one that had prompted him to ask us for money, had never actually occurred. The startup in question had secured its funding round successfully. Zephyr had simply wanted to test whether we could be manipulated into providing additional capital. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of such news," Vesper said softly. "But given what you've shared about your limited access to your grandchildren, I thought you should have all the facts." Thaddeus, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the meeting, finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "What are our options?" Vesper outlined several possible approaches, from attempting to have the property deed reversed due to misuse to reporting the potential financial fraud to authorities. But all of these options carried significant risks, most notably They could push Eleonora even further away if she wasn't ready to see the truth about her husband. There's one other option, Vesper suggested carefully. The mortgage and equity loans are technically in default. As the original owners who have continued to pay the property taxes, you could potentially step in to satisfy the debt, which would give you certain rights regarding the property. And then what? I asked, trying to see where this path might lead. Then you would be in a position to make decisions about the property, including whether the current occupants can continue to live there rent-free. It was a radical step, one that would undoubtedly cause immediate conflict. But after years of being gradually pushed out of our daughter's life, of watching her become more isolated and controlled, of being denied meaningful relationships with our grandchildren, perhaps a radical step was exactly what was needed. Do it, I said finally, after exchanging a long look with Thaddeus. Find out exactly how much is owed, and we'll pay it off. The process took nearly 2 months, during which time we made repeated attempts to speak directly with Eleonora about our concerns. Each attempt was intercepted by Zephyr, who became increasingly hostile, even threatening to file a restraining order if we didn't respect their boundaries. Finally, on a crisp autumn morning, Vesper called to confirm that the financial arrangements had been completed. The defaulted loans had been satisfied, and we now effectively controlled the future of the property. What happens next is entirely up to you, she advised. But whatever you decide, I suggest you document everything. Every conversation, every text message, every interaction. If this escalates further, that documentation will be crucial. Thaddeus and I spent a sleepless night discussing our next move. Part of me wanted to immediately demand they vacate the property, to make them feel the same pain and rejection they had inflicted on us. But Thaddeus, ever the voice of reason, suggested a more measured approach. Let's give Eleonora one more chance, he urged. One honest conversation, just the 3 of us, without Zephyr present. If she still chooses to shut us out after knowing the full truth, then we'll proceed with more drastic measures. I agreed, and the next morning I sent Eleonora a text. We need to talk. Just you, me, and your father. It's about the Cypress. Haven property. Please meet us at Vesper's office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Her response came hours later, terse and defensive. Can't make it. Aurelia has a play date. I replied with uncharacteristic firmness. This isn't optional, Eleonora. If you don't come, decisions will be made without your input. For nearly a day, there was no response. Then, just as we were about to give up hope, she replied, Fine, but only for 30 minutes. When Eleonora arrived at Vesper's office the next day, she looked both defiant and exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she had lost weight since I'd last seen her. She sat across from us, arms crossed, a protective barrier between us and her heart. Make it quick, she said without preamble. Zephyr doesn't know I'm here, and I'd like to keep it that way. That single statement told me everything I needed to know about the state of their relationship, that she felt the need to hide a simple meeting with her own parents from her husband. Still, I proceeded cautiously. Eleonora, we've discovered some concerning information about the loans taken out against Cypress Haven, I began. As Vesper methodically presented the evidence of Zephyr's financial manipulations, Eleonora's defensive posture gradually crumbled. She uncrossed her arms, then leaned forward to examine the documents more closely, her designer sunglasses slipping down to reveal eyes that widened with each new revelation. This can't be right, she whispered. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Zephyr said the first loan was for renovations to the kitchen and master bath, and the second was for Aurelia's college fund. And the third? Thaddeus asked gently. Eleonora hesitated, confusion clouding her features. There is no third loan. I never signed for a third loan. Vesper silently placed the document in front of her, The equity line from 8 months ago bearing a signature that was clearly meant to be Eleonora's, but, now that we examined it more closely, didn't quite match her handwriting on the other documents. Eleonora's hand flew to her mouth. "I didn't sign this," she whispered. "I never even saw this document." The revelation seemed to unlock something in her. Suddenly, she was talking rapidly, connecting dots that had been scattered throughout her marriage. Unexplained absences, mysterious phone calls, inconsistent explanations about their finances, and gradual restrictions on her professional work and personal relationships. "He told me that you were trying to control me through the property," she admitted, tears filling her eyes. "That you resented him for taking me away from the family business, that you were judgmental about our lifestyle." She looked up, her gaze direct for the first time. "He said you questioned my ability as a mother because I didn't raise the children the way you wanted." "Oh, Eleonora," I breathed, my heart breaking all over again. Nothing could be further from the truth. All we've ever wanted was to be part of your lives, to know our grandchildren, to support you in whatever path you chose. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like we might be breaking through. Eleonora's eyes softened, her defenses visibly lowering. But then her phone buzzed, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. She glanced at it, and I watched the wall go back up between us. "I have to go," she said abruptly, gathering her purse and standing. "Zephyr is wondering where I am." "Eleonora, please," Thaddeus pleaded. "Now that you know the truth, let us help you. Whatever you need, legal support, a place to stay, financial assistance to get back on your feet, it's yours." She hesitated at the door, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might turn back. But then her phone buzzed again, and whatever moment of clarity she had experienced was gone. "I need to think," she said, not meeting our eyes. "Just don't do anything about the property yet. Please." We agreed to give her time, but as days stretched into weeks with no further contact, our hopes dimmed. Thaddeus and I made repeated attempts to reach out, sending messages expressing our love and concern, offering help without judgment, even driving by Cypress Haven, hoping to catch a glimpse of the children. Then came the certified letter from an attorney we didn't recognize. Its language was cold and unambiguous. Eleonora and Zephyr Blackwood were requesting that we cease all contact with them and their children. Any attempt to visit the property would be considered trespassing. Any communication would be grounds for a formal restraining order. The letter concluded with a statement that felt like a knife to my heart. "Mrs. Blackwood has made it clear that she does not wish for her children to have a relationship with grandparents who would use financial manipulation and threats regarding their home as leverage." Thaddeus read the letter twice, then set it down with hands that trembled with a mixture of grief and anger. "They've twisted everything," he said quietly. "Made us the villains in this story." That night, after hours of tearful discussion, we made the hardest decision of our lives. If Cypress Haven, our family's legacy, the gift we had given with such love and hope, had become nothing more than a pawn in Zephyr's manipulations and a symbol of our exclusion from our daughter's life, then perhaps it was time to remove it from the equation altogether. The next morning, I called Vesper and gave her instructions that made my voice break even as I spoke them. "Put the property on the market as soon as possible." Part 3. The Unexpected Turn. What I couldn't have anticipated was how quickly everything would unravel once we made that decision. The real estate market in Meridian Bay was booming, and Cypress Haven, with its waterfront location and historic pedigree, attracted immediate interest. Within 48 hours of listing, we had 3 offers, all above asking price, all with minimal contingencies. I was reviewing these offers with our real estate agent when my phone rang, displaying Eleonora's number for the first time in weeks. My hand trembled as I answered. "How could you?" she demanded without preamble, her voice raw with emotion. "You're selling our home? The children's home?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The property that Zephyr has been secretly mortgaging? The home you've banned us from visiting? Yes, Eleonora, we're selling it. You can't do this, she insisted, but there was a note of panic beneath the anger now. Where are we supposed to go? The same place any other family goes when they can no longer live rent-free in a multi-million-dollar property, I replied, surprised by my own firmness. You find a place you can actually afford. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of her uneven breathing. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost bewildered. I thought you were bluffing, using the property to force your way back into our lives. This isn't a game, Eleonora, I said, my own voice softening despite everything. This is about years of being pushed away, of watching you become someone we barely recognize, of being denied any relationship with our grandchildren. If selling Cypress Haven is what it takes for you to understand how deeply you've hurt us, then so be it. Another silence, longer this time. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. Zephyr says you never really gave me the property. That legally, it was always a loan. And there it was, the heart of the manipulation, the lie that had allowed him to control her. That's absolutely false, I countered immediately. We signed over the deed completely. The only reason we're able to sell it now is because of the defaulted loans Zephyr took out, loans you say you didn't even know about. If you don't believe me, ask Vesper. She handled the original transfer. I heard a sharp intake of breath, then the muffled sound of a door closing. When Eleonora spoke again, her voice was hushed, as if she was hiding from someone. Things are bad, Mom. Worse than you know. Zephyr. She faltered. He's not who I thought he was. My heart raced. Eleonora, are you and the children safe? Physically, yes, she answered after a pause that lasted too long. But everything else is falling apart. Zephyr's latest venture collapsed last month. Investors are asking questions. There have been threats. I gripped the phone tighter. Tell me where you are. Your father and I will come right now. I can't, she whispered. Zephyr checks the security cameras. He monitors my phone. The only reason I can call now is because he's meeting with his lawyer. The control he exerted over her life was even more extensive than I'd feared. Listen to me carefully, I instructed, trying to keep my voice calm despite my rising alarm. Next Tuesday at 2 p.m., take the children to Meridian Bay Public Library. Go to the children's section. Tell Zephyr it's for story hour if you need an excuse. I'll meet you there. I don't know if I can find a way, I interrupted gently. Please, Eleonora. For Aurelia, Orion, and Lyra. For yourself. After another long pause, she agreed, though her voice still held uncertainty. Before ending the call, she added, one last thing that kept me awake that night. Don't sell the house yet, Mom. Please. It might be the only leverage we have left. The week until our meeting crawled by with excruciating slowness. I confided in Thaddeus, of course, and together we made discreet preparations, consulting with Vesper about potential legal scenarios, researching resources for domestic financial abuse, and even preparing our guest rooms in case they were needed. When Tuesday finally arrived, I reached the library 30 minutes early, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. I positioned myself near the children's section, pretending to browse through picture books while constantly watching the entrance. At 2:15 p.m., with no sign of Eleonora, my hope began to waver. By 2:30, I was fighting back tears of disappointment and worry. Had she changed her mind? Had Zephyr somehow discovered her plans? Then, just as I was about to give up, I spotted them. Eleonora hurrying through the main doors with Aurelia clutching. One hand and a double stroller containing the twins pushed ahead of her. Her face was tense, her movements rushed, but she was here. Our eyes met across the room, and for an instant I saw my little girl again, the one who had once run to me with skinned knees and broken toys, trusting that I could fix whatever was wrong in her world. Then Aurelia spotted me, and her reaction stunned me. "Gamma!" she shrieked with delight, breaking free from Eleonora's grasp and running toward me with arms outstretched. I knelt to catch her, tears springing to my eyes as her small arms wrapped around my neck. She remembered me. Despite everything, she remembered. "I told her stories about you," Eleonora explained quietly as she reached us, maneuvering the stroller alongside. "About both of you. Every night. No matter what Zephyr said." The twins were awake, their curious eyes, so like Thaddeus's, examining me with solemn interest. They wouldn't remember me, of course, having been kept away since their earliest days. But the opportunity to finally see them up close, to touch their perfect small hands, filled me with a bittersweet joy. We moved to a private study room I had reserved, and once the children were settled with books and quiet toys, Eleonora finally told us everything. Zephyr's business failures were far more serious than she'd initially let on. His investment firm was under investigation for fraud, and several former clients had filed lawsuits. The family's finances were in ruins. Credit cards maxed out, bank accounts nearly empty, luxury items being quietly sold off to maintain appearances. "The only asset we have left is Cypress Haven," she admitted, her voice breaking. "And I've just learned that Zephyr forged my signature on documents to borrow against it a fourth time 3 weeks ago. He told me it was to pay the children's private school tuition, but the school called yesterday asking about the overdue payments." Her hands trembled as she pulled documents from her bag, bank statements, legal notices, threatening letters from creditors. The scope of Zephyr's deception was breathtaking, as was the level of isolation he had engineered to keep Eleonora from discovering the truth. "He monitors all our accounts, checks my phone, has cameras in the house," she explained. "He convinced me that my design career would detract from my role as a mother, so I gave it up. He said your concerns about him were just jealousy and control tactics. I believed him because—" She hesitated, shame coloring her features. "Because it was easier than admitting I might have made a terrible mistake." "Oh, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "We all make mistakes. The question is what we do once we recognize them." Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Mom. If I leave him, he'll fight for custody. His parents have connections, money for legal battles. He's already told me no judge would grant custody to a mother with no income, no home of her own. That's what he wants you to believe," I countered firmly. "But it's not true, and you're not alone in this fight." I squeezed her hand. "Your father and I are here. We always have been." For the first time in years, she didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped my hand like it was a lifeline in a stormy sea. "The children," she whispered. "I need to protect the children." "And we will," I promised, "all of us together." What followed was an intense whispered strategy session, interrupted occasionally by Aurelia's questions or the twins' needs. By the time our hour was up, we had the beginnings of a plan, one that would require courage, precise timing, and the element of surprise. As we prepared to leave separately, Eleonora first to avoid any suspicion, Aurelia clung to me, her small face crumpling with the threat of tears. "Don't go, Gamma. Don't go, Gamma," she pleaded, her tiny fingers clutching the fabric of my blouse with surprising strength. I knelt to her level, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll see you again very soon, my little starlight. I promise." I pressed a small carved wooden fox into her palm, a talisman from my own childhood that I'd brought specifically for her. "Keep this safe for me until we meet again, okay?" Her eyes widened at the gift, momentarily distracted from her distress. She nodded solemnly, clutching the fox to her chest. "I promise." As I watched them leave, Eleonora pushing the stroller, with Aurelia walking reluctantly beside her, The weight of what we were planning settled heavily on my shoulders. We were about to upend multiple lives, challenge a man who had proven himself both deceptive and controlling, and navigate a legal minefield that could potentially separate my daughter from her children if we made a single misstep. Thaddeus was waiting in the car, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as I slid into the passenger seat. "How are they?" he asked immediately. "They're alive," I answered truthfully. "But she's trapped, Thaddeus, more completely than we realized." I relayed everything Eleonora had told me as we drove home, watching my husband's expression darken with each new revelation. "We should have seen it sooner," he said finally, voice rough with emotion. "All the signs were there." "We saw what we could," I reminded him gently. Zephyr was careful to keep the worst hidden, and Eleonora wasn't ready to let us help until now. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of discreet preparations. Vesper helped us file emergency petitions with the court, documenting the financial abuse and fraudulent activity. We contacted a private investigator recommended by Vesper's firm to gather additional evidence of Zephyr's business dealings. Most importantly, we prepared our home to receive 4 additional occupants on short notice, should our plan succeed. Everything hinged on timing and evidence. Eleonora needed to secure certain documents from Zephyr's home office: bank statements, investment records, the original deed to Cypress Haven, while simultaneously ensuring the children were safely away from the property when the confrontation inevitably occurred. We were scheduled to meet again the following Tuesday, but late Sunday night, my phone rang, displaying Eleonora's number. "He knows," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water, presumably to mask her call from surveillance. Someone at the library recognized us and mentioned seeing me to Marietta. "Zephyr went through my phone and found your number in the call history." My heart seized. "Where is he now?" "Downstairs drinking. He's—" She hesitated. "He's angrier than I've ever seen him. He keeps saying he's handled things, that I'll regret trying to go behind his back." Fear clawed at my throat. "Eleonora, listen to me. Take the children and leave right now. Don't pack, don't wait. Just get out." "I can't," she whispered, desperation edging her voice. "He's disabled my car somehow, and he's watching the doors." I was already gesturing frantically to Thaddeus, who was reaching for his keys before I even covered the phone to explain. "We're coming," I told her. "Find somewhere safe to wait with the children. A bathroom with a lock, maybe. Text the word blue if you can't talk. Can you do that?" "Yes," she breathed. "Please hurry." The 20-minute drive to Cypress Haven felt like the longest journey of my life. Thaddeus drove with uncharacteristic aggression, running yellow lights and taking corners too sharply, while I maintained a steady stream of text messages with Eleonora. So far, she was responding with simple blue confirmations every few minutes, indicating she was okay, but couldn't speak freely. As we turned onto the long private drive leading to the house, Thaddeus suddenly cut the headlights, allowing us to approach in darkness. The property was ablaze with light, every window illuminated as if for a party, though there were no other cars visible. We parked some distance from the main entrance, behind a cluster of ancient oak trees that would shield our arrival. "Call the police," Thaddeus instructed, his voice taut with restraint. "Tell them we fear for our daughter and grandchildren's safety." As I made the call, Thaddeus moved swiftly toward the house, his tall frame surprisingly agile for a man in his 60s. I followed a few paces behind, phone pressed to my ear as I relayed our situation to the dispatcher, who promised officers would arrive within minutes. We reached the side entrance, a French door that opened onto the garden patio, rarely used but more discreet than the front door. Through the glass panels, we could see into the kitchen, where Zephyr was pacing back and forth, a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, his phone in the other. He appeared to be arguing with someone on the line, his free hand gesticulating wildly. Thaddeus tried the handle, locked as expected. Without hesitation, he removed his jacket, wrapped it around his arm, and smashed his elbow through one of the glass panels. The sound of breaking glass momentarily drowned out by what appeared to be Zephyr's own shouting inside. My husband reached through the broken panel, unlocked the door from inside, and pushed it open. Zephyr spun at the sound, nearly dropping his phone. "What the—" His face contorted with rage when he recognized us. "You have no right to be here. This is breaking and entering." "Where is my daughter?" Thaddeus demanded, his voice dangerously calm. Zephyr sneered, ending his call and pocketing his phone. "None of your business. Eleonora doesn't want to see you. She's made that perfectly clear." From upstairs came the faint sound of a child, crying. My entire body tensed. "Eleonora!" I called out. "We're here!" Zephyr moved with unexpected speed, blocking the doorway to the hall. "Get out of my house before I call the police." "We already have," I informed him coldly. "They're on their way. Now move away from the door." Something flickered in Zephyr's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or calculation. Then his expression smoothed into something more controlled. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone suddenly reasonable. "Eleonora and I had a disagreement earlier, but everything's fine now. She's upstairs putting the children to bed." As if on cue, there was a creak on the landing above, and Eleonora appeared at the top of the stairs. Aurelia balanced on her hip. Her face was pale but composed. "Mom, Dad," she acknowledged with remarkable steadiness. "I'm sorry about this. Everything's under control now." I studied her carefully. Her posture was rigid, her eyes darting briefly to Zephyr before returning to us. Behind her, I could just make out the twins' room, the door ajar with a soft light glowing within. "See?" Zephyr spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Just a family misunderstanding. Now, if you'll excuse us, it's late, and—" "If everything's fine," I interrupted, meeting Eleonora's gaze directly. "Then you won't mind if I see the children." Just to ease my worry. Zephyr's mask of congeniality slipped for an instant. "Actually, I do mind. It's past their bedtime and—" "Starlight," I called up to Aurelia, ignoring Zephyr completely. "Did you keep my fox safe?" Aurelia's face lit up. "Gamma!" She squirmed in Eleonora's arms, trying to get down. "I kept it safe. I want to show you." Eleonora's expression shifted subtly. Relief, mixed with determination. She set Aurelia down, whispering something in her ear. "The—" Child nodded enthusiastically and disappeared back into the bedroom. "Enough of this," Zephyr snapped, his veneer of civility completely gone now. "Both of you, get out. Now." Thaddeus hadn't moved from his position blocking the door, and now he crossed his arms, his stance making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "That's not happening, Zephyr." I heard it then, the distant wail of sirens approaching. Zephyr heard it too, his eyes widening with sudden panic. "What have you done?" he hissed at Eleonora. "What I should have done months ago," she replied, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I know about the forged signatures, Zephyr. I know about the lawsuits, the missing money, all of it." Zephyr's face drained of color, then flushed. With rage. "You ungrateful—" He lunged toward the stairs, but Thaddeus was faster, grabbing him by the shoulder and yanking him backward with enough force to send him stumbling into the kitchen island. "Don't even think about it," Thaddeus warned, positioning himself at the bottom of the stairs as Eleonora hurried down. The twins now balanced expertly on each hip, while Aurelia clutched the back of her mother's shirt, the wooden fox grasped tightly in her other hand. The sound of car doors slamming outside signaled the arrival of the police. Zephyr, seemingly recognizing the inevitability of what was happening, made one last desperate attempt. "Eleonora," he said, his voice suddenly soft, pleading. "Don't do this. Think of the children. Think of everything we've built together." Eleonora didn't even glance in his direction as she guided her children toward the door. That's exactly what I'm doing. The next few hours passed in a blur of police questions, hastily packed overnight bags, and reassurances to 3 confused and frightened children. By dawn, we were all back at our home. Eleonora and the children settled into the guest rooms we had prepared, Zephyr in police custody for questioning about the financial fraud allegations, and Thaddeus and I exhausted but grateful that the most dangerous part of our plan had been executed successfully. The legal battle that followed was neither easy nor quick. Zephyr, backed by his parents' resources, hired a top divorce attorney and fought for both assets and custody with vicious determination. He painted Eleonora as mentally unstable, claimed she had abandoned the family home, and even suggested that Thaddeus had physically threatened him during our confrontation. But Vesper had prepared us well. The evidence of financial fraud was irrefutable, particularly after the forensic accountant completed his analysis of the family's finances. The forged signatures on loan documents were proven by a handwriting expert. Most damning of all, 3 of Zephyr's former business associates came forward with testimony about his fraudulent practices after the case made local headlines. 4 excruciating months later, the divorce was finalized. Eleonora received full custody of the children, with Zephyr granted supervised visitation pending the outcome of the criminal charges against him. The family court judge was particularly unimpressed by Marietta Blackwood's testimony, during which she suggested that Eleonora was an unfit mother because she allowed her parents to interfere in her marriage. From the evidence presented, the judge had responded dryly, it appears Mrs. Thorne Blackwood's parents saved both her and possibly her children from an increasingly volatile situation. That speaks to good judgment, not poor parenting. Throughout the ordeal, Eleonora displayed a strength I hadn't seen in years. She reactivated her professional contacts, secured a position at a respected design firm, and enrolled in therapy to process the emotional aftermath of her marriage. She was rebuilding, her life piece by piece, growing more confident with each small victory. The only question that remained unresolved was Cypress Haven. With the legal proceedings ongoing, we had withdrawn it from the market, but its future remained uncertain. The property was still technically in Eleonora's name, though encumbered by Zephyr's fraudulent loans, which had been frozen pending criminal investigation. On a crisp spring morning almost a year after that fateful night, Eleonora asked me to join her for a walk along the riverfront path that wound behind Cypress Haven. The property had stood vacant since that night, maintained by a service, but unlived in, a beautiful shell holding complicated memories. I've been thinking about the house, she said as we strolled, watching Aurelia race ahead of us while the twins, now steady on their feet, toddled between us. About what it means to all of us. I waited, sensing she had more to say. When you and Dad gave it to me, it was an act of love, of faith in my future, she continued thoughtfully. But Zephyr twisted that gift into something else, a tool for control, a stage for his performance as a successful businessman. He tainted every room with his lies. She paused, bending to adjust Orion's sun hat. For months, I've been struggling with what to do. Part of me wants to reclaim it, to wash away those negative associations and create new memories there. But another part feels like it might always be haunted by what happened, I finished for her. She nodded, relief in her eyes at being understood. Exactly. And then last week, I was looking through old family photos with Aurelia, and I found pictures of the summer house at Lake Windermere. I smiled at the memory. The lake house had been my grandparents' property, a simple but charming cabin where we had spent countless summer holidays when Eleonora was growing up. We had reluctantly sold it when my grandmother needed specialized care in her final years. Aurelia was fascinated by the pictures, Eleonora continued. She made me tell her every story I could remember about that place. And it hit me. That's the kind of family legacy I want for my children. Not a showpiece property that becomes a symbol of status or control, but a place that's genuinely about family, about connection. She stopped walking, turning to face me directly. I want to sell Cypress Haven, Mom. I've already discussed it with Vesper, and once the final lien issues are resolved, it should be possible. But I didn't want to move forward without talking to you and Dad first, given everything you've invested in that property, emotionally and financially. I reached out to cup her cheek, so proud of the woman standing before me, stronger, wiser, but still with the same generous heart she'd always had. The house was a gift, Eleonora. What you do with it has always been your decision. If selling brings you peace and helps you move forward, then that's exactly what you should do. Relief flooded her expression. Thank you for understanding. She hesitated, then added softly, There's more to it, actually. I found a property, nothing as grand as Cypress Haven, but perfect for us. A craftsman bungalow near the lake, with a garden for the children and enough room that you and Dad could stay comfortably when you visit. Which I hope will be often, she added with a smile. Nothing would make us happier, I assured her, my heart full. And I was thinking, she continued, suddenly seeming almost shy, if there's anything left from the sale of Cypress Haven after settling the legal expenses, maybe we could look into whether the Lake Windermere property might be available again. As a family place where we could all spend summers together, build new traditions. I couldn't speak around the lump in my throat, so I simply pulled her into a fierce hug, mindful of Lyra balanced on her hip. Over Eleonora's shoulder, I could see Aurelia crouched by the riverbank, carefully examining a smooth stone she had found, just as her mother had done at the same age, just as I had done before her. Some legacies, I realized, had nothing to do with property deeds or financial investments. The most valuable inheritances were the invisible ones, the curiosity, the resilience, the capacity for love that flowed through generations like the river beside us, constantly moving, yet somehow always the same. 6 months later, on a golden autumn afternoon, we gathered on the deck of the newly reacquired Lake Windermere cabin. The property had indeed become available, and with the proceeds from Cypress Haven, which had sold for well above market value to a young architect who appreciated its history, both Eleonora's new home and the lake house had been secured. Thaddeus was teaching Aurelia how to fish off the small private dock, their heads bent together in serious concentration. The twins were napping inside after an exciting morning of exploration, and Eleonora and I sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunlight dance across the water. I received a letter from Zephyr yesterday, she said suddenly, her voice steady, despite the unexpected subject. His first communication since the final court date. I tensed involuntarily. What did he want? To apologize, supposedly. She shook her head slightly. 5 pages justifying his actions, explaining how pressured he felt by his parents' expectations, how he never meant for things to go so far, followed by 1 paragraph asking for forgiveness and suggesting we consider a fresh start for the children's sake. My hands tightened around my mug. And how do you feel about that? A small, knowing smile curved her lips. 2 years ago, I might have believed him. I might have convinced myself that people can change, that everyone deserves a second chance. And maybe some do, but... She looked out at Aurelia's delighted face as Thaddeus helped her reel in what appeared to be her first catch. My children deserve better than to be raised around manipulation and control, no matter how eloquently it's disguised as love. I listened with profound respect as my daughter, the same woman who had once been so entangled in Zephyr's web that she had cut us out of her life, articulated boundaries with calm certainty. I wrote back a single paragraph, she continued. I told him I acknowledge his apology, that I hope he finds healing and peace, and that all future communication regarding the children should continue through our attorneys as previously arranged. That was generous of you, I observed. She smiled, something serene and settled in her expression. Not generous, just finished. I don't hate him anymore, Mom. That's too exhausting to maintain. But I don't need him either, and I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of appearances or misplaced obligation. From the dock came a squeal of triumph as Aurelia successfully landed her fish, a modest sunfish that she nevertheless regarded with the pride of a master angler. "Gamma, I caught one. Come see?" Eleonora nudged me with a smile. "Go. Your granddaughter requires an appropriately impressed audience." As I made my way down to the dock, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From the pain of being shut out of my daughter's life to the joy of this moment, with my family reunited and thriving in ways I had feared might never be possible. The sale of Cypress Haven hadn't been about punishment or revenge, though in my darkest moments during those years of separation, such motives had certainly tempted me. In the end, it had been about breaking patterns, removing the physical symbol of control that had facilitated Zephyr's manipulation, and creating space for something healthier to grow in its place. "Isn't it beautiful, Gamma?" Aurelia asked, solemnly displaying her wriggling catch with careful hands. "The most beautiful fish I've ever seen," I assured her with equal seriousness, and was rewarded with a smile that reflected the same resilience I had witnessed in her mother, the ability to find joy in simple things, to build something new from whatever life offers, whether gift or challenge. Later that evening, as the children slept and Thaddeus built a fire in the old stone fireplace, Eleonora revealed one final surprise. She had been offered a position designing a new eco-friendly community center in Meridian Bay, the kind of prestigious project that would establish her independent reputation in the field. They specifically want to incorporate elements of local historical architecture while meeting modern sustainability standards, she explained, excitement brightening her features. "And the best part? I'll be partnering with Ferguson and Associates on the structural elements." Ferguson and Associates was the firm that had purchased our architecture business when Thaddeus semi-retired 3 years earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on any of us. Eleonora returning to her professional roots, but this time on her own terms, with her own vision leading the way. "They've asked if you might consult on some of the historical authenticity aspects," she added, looking at Thaddeus. "No pressure, of course, but they were quite excited when I mentioned you're my father." Thaddeus tried to look nonchalant, but I could see how deeply touched he was by the invitation. "I might be persuaded," he said gruffly, "assuming my fee of unlimited grandchild time is acceptable." Eleonora laughed, a full, unguarded sound that I had missed during the years of her marriage. "I think that can be arranged." As the conversation drifted to other topics, I found myself reflecting on the title of the letter I had received from a distant acquaintance shortly after the news of our family drama had circulated through our social circle. "My daughter banned me from meeting my grandchildren, so I sold the house they'd been living in rent-free." How incomplete that summary had been. How it had reduced a complex story of manipulation, courage, and eventual healing to a simple tale of retribution. The truth, as always, contained more nuance, more pain, and ultimately more redemption than any headline could capture. Yes, I had sold the house my daughter and her family had been living in rent-free after being banned from seeing my grandchildren. But that action hadn't been the end of our story. It had been the beginning of a new chapter, one in which honest confrontation cleared the way for genuine reconciliation. As I watched Eleonora laughing with Thaddeus, her face illuminated by firelight, I silently thanked whatever combination of courage and desperation had prompted me to take that difficult step. Sometimes I realized the greatest act of love isn't providing shelter or financial support or even unconditional acceptance. Sometimes it's having the strength to disrupt a harmful pattern, even when doing so feels momentarily cruel. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" Eleonora asked, noticing my contemplative expression. "You look a million miles away." I smiled, returning to the present moment with gratitude. Not miles, I corrected gently. Years. I was just thinking about how sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most unexpected blessings. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Like selling a house to save a family. Exactly like that, I agreed, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Outside, the lake lapped softly against the shore, a constant soothing rhythm that had witnessed generations of our family's story, and would, I hoped, witness many more to come. The deed to this property might bear Eleonora's name now, but its true ownership transcended legal documents. It belonged to all of us, to our shared past and our intertwined future, to the love that had survived estrangement and betrayal to emerge stronger on the other side. And in the end, that was the only legacy that truly mattered. After 15 years of managing the family estate in Windermere, I never imagined I'd find myself in the position of selling the very property I had so lovingly maintained for my children's inheritance. Yet here I was, signing the final paperwork that would transfer ownership of Herondale Manor to a real estate development company. The irony wasn't lost on me. The home I had preserved for Verity and her family would now become luxury condominiums, all because my own daughter had decided I wasn't worthy of meeting my grandchildren. Are you absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Whitfield? Attorney Imogen Blackburn asked, sliding the documents across her polished mahogany desk. Her eyes, shrewd but kind, studied my face for any signs of hesitation. More certain than I've been about anything in years, I replied, uncapping my fountain pen, a gift from Verity on my 50th birthday, back when we still celebrated such occasions together. The ink flowed smoothly as I signed my name, Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, on each flagged line. Herondale has been in your family for 4 generations, Imogen reminded me gently. Once this sale is complete, there's no going back. I paused, the weight of finality settling around my shoulders like a heavy cloak. The estate had been my sanctuary since Callum's death 8 years ago. 60 acres of rolling meadows, ancient oaks, and gardens that bloomed from early spring until late autumn. The Victorian manor house at its center had weathered world wars, economic depressions, and family tragedies with quiet dignity. Each room held memories, Verity learning to walk in the sunlit conservatory, her wedding reception in the rose garden, the quiet Christmases after Callum's passing when grief hung between us like an unwelcome guest. I'm fully aware of what I'm giving up, I said finally. But a house should be filled with family, with voices and laughter. Herondale has been too quiet for too long. Imogen nodded, gathering the signed documents with efficient movements. The funds will be transferred to your account within 48 hours. The new owners have requested access beginning Monday to start preliminary assessments. That's fine, I said, rising from my chair with as much grace as my arthritis would allow. I'll be moved into the cottage by then. The cottage in question was a modest 2-bedroom property on the outskirts of town, charming in its way, with climbing roses and a small garden, but a far cry from the grandeur of Herondale. For a woman who had spent decades overseeing a significant estate, it represented a dramatic downsizing. But it would be enough for me. More than enough, considering the circumstances. As I drove back to Herondale for one of my final weekends in residence, my thoughts drifted to the chain of events that had led to this moment. 5 years ago, my relationship with Verity had been strained but intact. We didn't always see eye to eye, particularly regarding her husband, Xavier Harrington, but we maintained the polite fiction of family harmony through holiday gatherings and occasional Sunday lunches. Xavier had always struck me as a man more concerned with appearances than substance. He came from new money, as my late husband would have said, and compensated for his lack of pedigree with aggressive ambition. From the moment he joined our family, he had been fascinated by Herondale, constantly questioning me about its history, its value, its upkeep costs. I had initially attributed his interest to natural curiosity, perhaps even a desire to understand the heritage his children would someday inherit. How naive I had been. The change had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. First, the Sunday visits became less frequent. Then Verity started declining invitations to family events, citing Xavier's work commitments or the children's busy schedules. When they did visit, Xavier would find reasons to cut the day short. Urgent business calls, childcare concerns, traffic considerations. I adapted, as mothers do. I offered to visit them instead. I suggested meeting at neutral locations, parks, restaurants, children's events. I sent thoughtful gifts and handwritten letters. But with each attempt, the wall between us grew higher, thicker, more impenetrable. Then came the incident at Perseus's 7th birthday party. I had been invited, a rare occurrence by that point, and had spent weeks selecting the perfect gift for my grandson, a handcrafted wooden telescope, commissioned from a local artisan who had apprenticed at the Greenwich Observatory. Perseus had been fascinated by astronomy since he was 4, and I knew this gift would delight him. Upon arriving at their suburban home, a modern monstrosity of glass and concrete that Xavier had designed himself, I was relegated to a corner of the garden with the other auxiliary guests, distant cousins, neighbors, colleagues' children. The inner circle consisted of Xavier's family, particularly his parents, who dominated the celebration with loud voices and expensive gifts. When the time came for Perseus to open his presents, my carefully wrapped telescope was placed at the bottom of the pile. By the time he reached it, he was overwhelmed and distracted. Xavier picked it up, examined the tag, and set it aside with barely a glance. "From your grandmother," he announced dismissively. "You can open it later." Later never came. As the party wound down, I approached Verity, asking quietly if Perseus might open my gift before I left. "Oh, Mother," she sighed, not meeting my eyes. "He's overstimulated already. We'll send you a photo when he opens it tomorrow." No photo ever arrived. When I called the following week, their housekeeper informed me they had gone on vacation to the Maldives, a trip no one had mentioned during the party. Upon their return, my calls went straight to voicemail. My carefully worded emails received brief, non-committal responses. When I finally managed to reach Verity by phone nearly a month later, her voice was cool, controlled. "Perseus loved the telescope, Mother. Very thoughtful. Though we already had one Xavier's father gave him last Christmas. A computerized model. From the Smithsonian collection." The subtext was clear. My gift, like my presents, was redundant, superfluous, unwanted. Still, I persisted. I was, after all, Perseus's only living grandparent on the Whitfield side. He and his younger sister, Calliope, deserved a connection to their heritage, to the family stories and traditions that had shaped their mother's life. The final rupture occurred during a rare visit to Herondale the following spring. Verity had brought the children for the afternoon, without Xavier, who was tied up with an important client. I had prepared a picnic for the gardens, cucumber sandwiches cut into stars, tiny strawberry tarts, lemonade in the crystal decanters that had been wedding gifts to my own grandparents. Perseus, now nearly 8, had warmed to me quickly, his initial shyness dissolving as I showed him the collection of fossils his grandfather had accumulated during his geological expeditions. Calliope, just turned 5, was initially more reserved, but became animated when I introduced her to the fairy garden, a secluded corner of the grounds where wildflowers grew in deliberate disarray around a small, moss-covered fountain. "Did real fairies make this?" she had asked, eyes wide with wonder. "Real people made it," I explained, kneeling beside her despite the protest from my knees. "But with enough imagination, perhaps we can invite the fairies to visit." We spent a magical hour creating tiny structures from twigs, leaves, and flower. Petals, fairy houses, Calliope called them. Her delighted laughter was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. The afternoon was proceeding so well that I made a critical error. I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps, I thought, this was a turning point. Perhaps Verity was finally recognizing the importance of maintaining family connections. Perhaps the children's obvious enjoyment would lead to more frequent visits, to a gradual healing of whatever mysterious wound had caused the rift between us. Then Verity's phone rang. She stepped away to answer it, her body language instantly tense. Though I couldn't hear her words, I could read the defensive posture, the quick, sharp gestures she made when agitated. When she returned, her face was composed into a mask of polite regret. "We need to go," she announced. "Xavier's coming home early. He wants us there for dinner." "But Mama," Calliope protested, her hand still full of the flower petals we had been arranging. "We haven't finished our fairy houses." "We haven't had the tarts yet," Perseus added, looking longingly at the picnic basket. "Now, children," Verity said, her voice taking on an edge I recognized from her own childhood tantrums. "We don't want to keep Daddy waiting." "Surely you could stay another hour," I suggested, trying to keep my voice light. "I could wrap up. Some tarts for Xavier as well." Verity's expression hardened. "He's expecting us, Mother, and he's had a difficult day." "Of course," I conceded, disappointed but unsurprised. "Perhaps you could bring the children again next weekend." "We could finish the fairy houses then, Calliope." Something flickered across Verity's face, a mixture of guilt and resolve. "We'll have to see what works with our schedule," she said, already gathering their belongings. "It's a busy time right now." As they prepared to leave, Calliope wrapped her small arms around my waist. "Can I take some fairy petals home, Gamma, to remember until next time?" "Of course, darling," I said, helping her select a few fallen blossoms, which she carefully placed in her pocket. Without thinking, I added, "And maybe someday soon you can spend the night here. There's a beautiful bedroom that used to be your mother's, with a canopy bed and a window seat perfect for reading stories." Calliope's eyes lit up, but before she could respond, Verity cut in sharply. "That won't be possible, Mother. We've discussed this." We hadn't, in fact, discussed any such thing. But I recognized the warning in her tone and didn't press the issue in front of the children. As they drove away down the long gravel drive, I waved until their car disappeared around the bend, then returned to the abandoned fairy garden. Kneeling beside the half-finished structures, I felt an ache that went beyond the physical discomfort in my joints. Something precious had visited briefly and departed, leaving only scattered petals as evidence it had ever been there at all. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It was formal, typed rather than handwritten, with a coldness that belied the fact that it came from my only child. "Dear Mother," it began, without the customary dearest she had used since learning to write. "Following our recent visit, Xavier and I feel it necessary to clarify some boundaries regarding our children's relationship with you." What followed was a clinical list of grievances, some so petty they would have been laughable if they hadn't been so painful. I had undermined their parental authority by offering dessert before the children had eaten their sandwiches. I had introduced Perseus to outdated scientific concepts by showing him his grandfather's fossil collection without emphasizing their religious views on creation. I had encouraged dangerous magical thinking in Calliope with the fairy garden. Most egregiously, according to the letter, I had attempted to manipulate the children's emotions by mentioning overnight visits when we have made it abundantly clear such arrangements are not part of our family plan. The letter concluded with a paragraph that I later memorized, not by choice, but through the sheer repetition of reading it in disbelief. Given these ongoing concerns, Xavier and I have made the difficult but necessary decision to restrict the children's contact with you until such time as you demonstrate respect for our parental choices and boundaries. Please do not attempt to contact Perseus or Calliope directly. Any gifts or correspondence should be sent through our family attorney, who will evaluate their appropriateness before passing them along. We hope that with time and reflection, you, will come to understand the importance of presenting a unified approach to the children's moral and intellectual development. It was signed simply Verity, without even the formality of her surname or the affection of your daughter. I read the letter 3 times in succession, then set it carefully on my desk and walked out to the garden. For hours, I moved methodically, through the rose beds, deadheading spent blooms and training new growth along the trellises, mindless physical work that required enough attention to temporarily quiet the roaring in my head. By evening, when I returned to the house, I had formulated my response. A single page, handwritten on the cream stationery Callum had always preferred for important correspondence. "My dearest Verity," I wrote, deliberately using the endearment she had abandoned. "Your letter has caused me profound grief, not only for myself but for you, and especially for Perseus and Calliope, who deserve the rich tapestry of love and perspective that extended family provides. I reject utterly the characterization of my behavior as undermining or manipulative. What you perceive as interference is simply the natural expression of a grandmother's love. The same love my own mother showed to you, which you once valued so deeply. That said, I will respect your wishes regarding contact with the children, however misguided I believe them to be. I will not force my presence where it is unwelcome. My door, heart, and arms remain open to all of you, should you reconsider this drastic severance of family bonds. I hope someday you will remember that before Xavier, before the children, before the woman you have become, you were a little girl who found wonder in fairy gardens and starlight. That girl is still part of you, as you are always part of me. With enduring love, your mother." I posted the letter the following morning and then waited, hoping against hope for a response that never came. Weeks passed, then months. I sent birthday cards to the children through the designated attorney, carefully neutral messages accompanied by modest checks. I received formal acknowledgments from the law firm, but never knew if my grandchildren actually received them. Christmas arrived, bringing with it the first holiday season in my adult life without family. I decorated Herondale as always, the 12-foot Norwegian spruce in the main hall, holly and ivy draped across mantels, my mother's collection of hand-blown glass ornaments arranged on the library tree. I baked the traditional Whitfield Christmas pudding, rich with dried fruits soaked for months in brandy. I wrapped carefully selected gifts that would likely be returned unopened. On Christmas Eve, alone in the vast house that had once resonated with Callum's laughter and Verity's childhood excitement, I made a decision. If Herondale could no longer serve its purpose, to shelter and nurture the Whitfield family through generations, then perhaps it was time to let it go. It took nearly 4 years to implement that decision. First, I consulted with financial advisors about the tax implications of selling such a significant property. Then I worked with curators to determine which furnishings and artworks should be donated to museums, which should be sold at auction, and which few precious pieces I would keep. I cataloged the library's collection of rare botanical texts for donation to the university where Callum had taught. I commissioned a complete, historical documentation of the estate, preserving in photographs and written records what would soon exist only in memory. Most painfully, I sorted through the personal items, Callum's tweed jacket still hanging in our closet, Verity's childhood art projects carefully preserved in acid-free boxes, the family photographs that chronicled 4 generations of Whitfields at Herondale. Through it all, I maintained the faint hope that Verity might reach out, that news of the impending sale might pierce whatever protective shell Xavier had constructed around their family unit. I didn't broadcast my intentions, but neither did I keep them secret. The historical documentation project received local press coverage. The museum donations were acknowledged in public records. The eventual listing of the property was featured in national real estate publications. If Verity was aware of these developments, she gave no indication. Her silence remained absolute. The offer from Meridian Development came 9 months after the property was listed. slightly below asking price but with favorable terms, including the provision that I could remain in residence for up to 6 months after closing while finalizing my relocation plans. I negotiated briefly, more from principle than financial necessity, and we reached an acceptable compromise. Now, driving back to Herondale from Imogen's office, I confronted the reality that I had just 72 hours left in the home where I had spent nearly 4 decades of my life. Most of my possessions had already been moved to the cottage or placed in storage. The remaining furniture would be collected by the estate sale company on Monday. By Tuesday evening, Herondale would exist for me only in photographs and memories. As I turned through the gates, wrought iron structures commissioned by my father-in-law to replace the original Victorian ironwork destroyed during a storm in the 1970s, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked in the circular drive, sleek, black, with tinted windows and diplomatic plates. My heart stuttered momentarily before logic reasserted itself. More likely a representative from Meridian Development than the miracle I still foolishly hoped for. I parked beside the unknown vehicle and walked slowly toward the main entrance, keys in hand. Before I could reach the door, it swung open to reveal a tall, distinguished man with silver-streaked dark hair and a well-tailored suit that screamed old money, the antithesis of Xavier's flashy designer labels. "Mrs. Margaret Whitfield?" he inquired, his accent placing him somewhere in upper-crust New England. "Yes," I confirmed cautiously. "And you are?" "Harrison Thornfield, executor of the Harrington Family Trust," he replied, extending a hand that bore a signet ring I recognized with a jolt, an intricate design featuring a stag's head encircled by ivy. I had last seen that ring on the hand of Xavier's grandfather, Bradford Harrington, at Verity's wedding 14 years earlier. Bradford had been notably different from the rest of the Harrington clan, quieter, more thoughtful, with an appreciation for history and tradition that seemed missing from his descendants. He had sought me out during the reception to compliment the gardens at Herondale, which he had visited once during his university days. We had spoken at length about heritage, properties, and the challenges of maintaining them in the modern era. "Mr. Thornfield," I acknowledged, shaking his hand briefly. "This is unexpected. How did you get in?" "Your housekeeper was kind enough to admit me," he explained. "Mrs. Chen, I believe. She's preparing tea in the morning room." Indeed, loyal Mrs. Chen, who had been with me since Callum's death and who had steadfastly refused my attempts to help her find new employment after the sale, appeared in the hallway behind him. "I've made your favorite Earl Grey, Mrs. Whitfield," she said with a small bow, "and set out the lemon biscuits." I thanked her with a nod, then turned back to my unexpected visitor. "I'm afraid I'm at a loss, Mr. Thornfield. What business does the Harrington Family Trust have with me? I signed the final divorce settlement with Callum's estate years ago, and Xavier has made it abundantly clear that our families have no ongoing connection." Thornfield's expression remained neutral, professional. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately, Mrs. Whitfield. The matter is somewhat delicate." Intrigued despite my wariness, I led him to the morning room, a lovely east-facing space where generations of Whitfield women had managed household correspondence over tea and biscuits. Unlike the grander rooms of Herondale, which had been systematically stripped of their contents over recent months, the morning room retained much of its original charm. My grandmother's writing desk still stood by the window. The botanical prints Callum had given me for our 10th anniversary still hung on the pale yellow walls. The silver tea service, one of the few valuable pieces I intended to keep, gleamed on the small mahogany table between 2 comfortable armchairs. Mrs. Chen poured our tea with practiced grace, then discreetly withdrew, closing the door behind her. "Now," I said, stirring a single spoon of sugar into my cup, "please explain why the Harrington Trust has taken a sudden interest in me after years of enforced silence." Thornfield set his cup down untouched and reached into his briefcase, Extracting a thick legal document bound in blue leather. Are you aware that Bradford Harrington died 6 weeks ago, Mrs. Whitfield? I wasn't, though the news saddened me. Bradford had been the only member of Xavier's family I had genuinely liked, even if our acquaintance had been brief. I wasn't informed. The funeral was private, Thornfield explained, family only by Bradford's explicit instruction. Something in his tone suggested this family-only designation was relevant to our conversation, but I couldn't imagine how. I had met the man precisely once, 14 years ago. I'm sorry for the family's loss, I said sincerely, but I still don't understand why you're here. Thornfield opened the leather portfolio, revealing a document with an impressive array of legal seals and signatures. Bradford Harrington made significant changes to his will 5 years ago, Mrs. Whitfield. Changes that directly impact you, your grandchildren, and the property you've just sold. I set my teacup down with a clink, suddenly uncertain whether my trembling hands could maintain their grip. I beg your pardon? Bradford was, to put it delicately, deeply dissatisfied with certain members of the Harrington family, particularly his grandson, Xavier. Thornfield's professional detachment slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of what might have been distaste. He monitored the situation with your daughter and grandchildren from a distance, and what he observed troubled him greatly. My mind raced, connecting invisible dots. 5 years ago, precisely when the rift between Verity and me had become unbridgeable, when the letter had arrived banning me from contact with Perseus and Calliope, when I had begun the slow, painful process of accepting that my family was lost to me. What situation? I asked carefully. And how did Bradford Harrington, who to my knowledge had minimal contact with Xavier's immediate family, come to monitor anything about my grandchildren? Thornfield hesitated, seemingly weighing his words. Bradford maintained relationships with several of the household staff employed by Xavier and Verity over the years. He received regular updates on the family's activities and dynamics. In other words, the old man had spies in his grandson's household. Under normal circumstances, I might have found this ethically questionable. Under the current circumstances, I was intensely curious about what those spies had reported. And what did these updates reveal that concerned him? I pressed. Thornfield's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes held a glimmer of something, sympathy perhaps, or recognition of a shared grievance. Bradford became aware of a pattern of behavior that he found deeply troubling: isolation of family members, financial control, emotional manipulation. Particularly concerning was the systematic effort to sever ties between you and your grandchildren, apparently motivated by Xavier's designs on Herondale. I nearly dropped my teacup. His designs on Herondale? What could Xavier possibly want with my family home? According to Bradford's documentation, Thornfield continued, Xavier became obsessed with Herondale after his first visit. He viewed it as a status symbol he could never acquire through legitimate means, a property with genuine history and architectural significance, unlike the modern showcases his parents favored. He believed that by isolating you from Verity and the children, he might eventually pressure you into transferring ownership, either during your lifetime or through your will. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I had blamed myself for the estrangement, questioned whether I had indeed overstepped boundaries, whether my old-fashioned values were genuinely harmful to the children, whether I had somehow failed as a mother and grandmother. To learn that the entire situation had been engineered as part of a calculated plan to acquire my property was both devastating and infuriating. Bradford found this behavior reprehensible, Thornfield continued, particularly given that Xavier was already a beneficiary of the Harrington Trust, with access to significant resources. The attempt to manipulate an elderly widow out of her Family home for purely egotistical reasons went against every principle Bradford valued. I'm hardly elderly, I interjected, automatically defensive despite the gravity of the situation. A ghost of a smile touched Thornfield's lips. Bradford's characterization, not mine, Mrs. Whitfield. I waved away the distinction. So Bradford Harrington discovered his grandson was behaving abominably toward me. That still doesn't explain why you're here, or what his will has to do with Herondale, which as of this morning is legally sold to Meridian Development. That, said Thornfield, turning to a specific page in the document before him, is where matters become interesting. He began to read aloud from what was clearly Bradford Harrington's will. To my great-grandchildren, Perseus Callum Harrington and Calliope Margaret Harrington, I leave the sum of $20 million each, to be held in trust until they reach the age of 30. This bequest is conditional upon their maintenance of a meaningful relationship with their maternal grandmother, Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, to be verified annually by the trust executor. The morning sunlight streamed through the east wing windows, casting long golden rectangles across the polished oak floors of Herondale. I sat at my writing desk, a cup of Earl Grey cooling beside me as I reviewed the document Harrison Thornfield had delivered by courier an hour earlier. The legal language was dense but clear in its purpose. The Harrington Whitfield Historical Preservation Trust was now officially the owner of Herondale Manor and its surrounding 60 acres. The property would be maintained as a historical landmark, with provisions for guided tours of certain areas, while ensuring the East Wing remained the private residence of the Whitfield family in perpetuity. My signature on the final page would complete the transaction, reversing the sale to Meridian Development and securing Herondale's future. Yet I hesitated, pen hovering above the line, as voices drifted in through the open window. No, Perseus. You're doing it all wrong. Calliope's exasperated tone carried clearly across the garden. Fairy houses need proper foundations. If you just stack the stones like that, the whole thing will collapse when it rains. That's structurally accurate, Perseus countered, his voice carrying the patient condescension unique to older brothers. But you're forgetting that fairies have magic. They can reinforce unstable structures with crystallized dewdrops. That's ridiculous, Calliope scoffed. Even magic needs to follow basic architectural principles, right, Mom? Verity's laugh, lighter and more carefree than I had heard in years, floated on the morning breeze. I think you're both overthinking this. Fairies appreciate creativity more than structural integrity. Their easy banter brought a smile to my face. 3 weeks had passed since their unexpected arrival at Herondale, and while the initial reunion had been tearful and tentative, each day had brought visible improvements. The shadows beneath Verity's eyes had faded. Perseus had emerged from his protective teenage shell, revealing flashes of the curious, thoughtful boy I remembered. Calliope had blossomed almost immediately, as if returning to Herondale had restored. A part of herself she hadn't known was missing. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway drew my attention from the window. A moment later, Verity appeared in the doorway, a stack of mail in her hands. "Morning Post," she announced, sorting through the envelopes. "Mostly for you. Wait, this one's addressed to me." She held up a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the distinctive letterhead of Sheffield and Blackwell, one of the region's most prestigious law firms. My pulse quickened. That would be from Imogen. Is it what we've been waiting for? Verity's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and extracted several documents. Her eyes scanned the first page rapidly, then slowed as she absorbed the details. When she looked up, her expression was a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and lingering pain. "It's done," she confirmed quietly. "The divorce has been finalized. No contest from Xavier." She hesitated, then added, "And the court approved the expedited custody arrangement. Primary physical custody granted to me, with supervised visitation, for Xavier at a neutral location, pending completion of his court-ordered counseling program. I set down my pen and crossed the room to embrace her, feeling the slight tremor that ran through her body. "How do you feel?" She considered the question seriously, as had always been her way, even as a child. "Relieved," she said finally. "Sad in some ways, not for what I've lost, but for what I once believed I had. And," she straightened slightly, squaring her shoulders, "determined to build something better. For the children. For myself." I nodded, understanding completely. That sounds exactly right. Verity glanced at the document, still awaiting my signature on the desk. "Is that the Harrington-Whitfield Trust Agreement? Have you decided?" I returned to the desk, lifting the weighty paper with its embossed letterhead. "I was just about to sign. Unless you have any reservations?" "About securing Herondale for future generations while ensuring we have a home that Xavier can't touch?" She smiled wryly. "I think I can live with that arrangement." I signed with a flourish, feeling a sense of rightness settle over me as the ink dried. The decision felt less like surrendering control of our family home and more like entrusting it to a future that extended beyond my individual lifespan, a future that would now include my grandchildren and, someday, their children as well. "There," I said, sliding the document into its envelope. "Herondale is officially preserved, and speaking of preservation projects, how is the fairy garden restoration proceeding?" Verity laughed, moving to the window that overlooked the children's activities. With much debate and creative disagreement, Perseus insists on incorporating scientifically plausible magical elements, while Calliope is more of a traditionalist. They've been working on it for days now. I joined her at the window, watching as Perseus carefully positioned a tiny mirror shard to reflect sunlight onto a miniature structure, while Calliope arranged minuscule furniture crafted from acorn caps and twigs. They seemed to be settling in, well, I observed cautiously, aware that the children's adjustment remained a delicate subject. While Perseus and Calliope had embraced their new living situation with surprising enthusiasm, we all recognized the potential for complicated emotions as they processed the dramatic changes in their family structure. Verity nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Better than I expected, honestly. Calliope has always been adaptable, but I worried about Perseus. He's at such a vulnerable age, and he was closer to Xavier in many ways." She sighed softly. "But Thornfield was right about one thing. Bradford's provisions for the children have made this transition much easier. Knowing their education is secure, that they'll have resources of their own someday, independent of either Xavier or me. It's given them a sense of stability amid all this upheaval." I hesitated, then voiced the question that had been lingering since their arrival. "And what about their feelings toward their father? They must miss him, despite everything." "They do," Verity acknowledged, her voice careful but honest. "Perseus especially. It's complicated, as it should be. Xavier was controlling and manipulative toward me, but he was also a father who coached Perseus's chess club and read Calliope bedtime stories. Children don't experience these situations in black and white. Nor should they, I agreed. Whatever Xavier's failings as a husband, he remains their father. They're entitled to love him without qualification." Verity gave me a grateful look, reaching for my hand. "Thank you for understanding that, for not—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Not making this about choosing sides. It would be easy to encourage them to vilify Xavier after everything he did to separate us. That would serve no one," I said firmly, "least of all Perseus and Calliope. They need to form their own relationships with both parents, based on their own experiences." We fell silent, watching the children work together on their fairy village, their heads bent in concentration as they debated the merits of different materials and designs. The scene reminded me so vividly of Verity at their age. Serious, creative, absolutely committed to whatever project had captured her imagination. "I've been thinking," Verity said suddenly, turning away from the window to face me directly, "about what happens next. For me, professionally." I raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. During our weeks together at Herondale, Verity had spoken extensively about her marriage, her children, the complex emotions surrounding her divorce, but she had said very little about her own future beyond these immediate concerns. "Before I married Xavier," she continued, her voice gaining confidence, "I was working toward my architecture license, following in Dad's footsteps, but with my own focus on historical preservation and adaptive reuse." I nodded, remembering how proud Callum had been of Verity's decision to join the family profession. "You were brilliant at it. Your professors practically begged you to continue your graduate studies." Then I met Xavier, and suddenly my career seemed secondary. He never explicitly told me to give it up, but there was always some reason why it made more sense for me to focus on supporting his work, managing our home, raising the children. She shook her head, frustration evident in the gesture. "I allowed myself to be diminished, Mother. To become a footnote in someone else's story." "You were young," I said gently. "And in love, or what you believed was love. That's a powerful combination." "Yes, but now I'm neither young nor in love," she replied with a rueful smile. "And thanks to Bradford's trust provisions, I have the financial freedom to choose my own path forward." She drew a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into uncertain waters. "I want to finish my licensure, to practice architecture, with a focus on projects like Herondale, historic properties that need thoughtful modernization without losing their essential character." Joy welled up within me, so intense it almost felt like pain. This was the Verity I had known before Xavier, passionate, purposeful, with a vision that extended beyond domestic boundaries. "That sounds perfect," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady, "and entirely achievable." "I'd need to update my education," she continued, clearly having given this considerable thought. "Take the current licensing exams, build a portfolio of new work." "All completely doable," I assured her, "and as it happens, I know of a historic property that might make an excellent first project for your portfolio." Verity's eyebrows rose, questioningly. "Herondale?" "But the trust agreement specifies minimal alterations to preserve its historical integrity." "Not Herondale," I clarified. "The Carrington Boathouse and Guest Quarters, about a mile downriver. It's been abandoned for decades, but the basic structure is sound. The trust is considering acquiring it as an auxiliary property, perhaps as an educational center for architectural preservation techniques, with accommodation for visiting scholars." Understanding dawned in Verity's eyes. "And they might need an architect with both professional training and intimate knowledge of the area's architectural history." "They might indeed," I confirmed with a smile, "especially one who lives conveniently nearby and has a personal stake in the region's heritage." Before Verity could respond, we were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Chen, who appeared in the doorway with her usual impeccable timing. "Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Thornfield has arrived for your meeting," she announced. "I've shown him to the library, as requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," I acknowledged. "Please let him know we'll join him shortly." As she departed, I turned back to Verity. "Care to discuss your potential first commission with the Trust's executor?" Verity's eyes widened. "Now?" "But I haven't prepared any preliminary thoughts or—" "This is an informal exploration," I assured her. "Besides, having observed your children's fairy village construction, I'd say your design instincts are still very much intact." She laughed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Fairy architecture isn't exactly the same as historic preservation." "Isn't it, though?" I countered. "Both require respecting existing conditions while creating something beautiful and functional. Both demand attention to detail and context. both serve to connect present users with past traditions. Verity considered this, then nodded slowly. When you put it that way, perhaps I've been practicing architecture all along, just on a miniature scale. Exactly, I agreed, linking my arm through hers as we made our way toward the library. And now it's time to apply those skills to structures large enough for actual human habitation. Harrison Thornfield rose as we entered the library, his formal demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing us together. Mrs. Whitfield, Ms. Verity, he greeted us. Thank you for making time on such short notice. Of course, I replied, gesturing for him to resume his seat while Verity and I took chairs across from him. I assume you've received the signed trust agreement? Indeed, he confirmed. As of this morning, Herondale is officially under the protection of the Harrington Whitfield Trust. Meridian Development has accepted the contract termination with remarkably good grace, considering the circumstances. Substantial financial penalties tend to encourage graciousness, I observed dryly. The trust had paid a significant sum to release Herondale from the Meridian contract, money well spent in my opinion, but not an insignificant amount. Indeed, Thornfield agreed with a small smile. But I'm not here solely to confirm the property transfer. There's another matter requiring your attention, one that Bradford anticipated might arise, though perhaps not quite so soon. He opened his briefcase and extracted a folder containing architectural renderings and what appeared to be historical photographs. Are you familiar with the Carrington property downstream? Verity and I exchanged surprised glances. We were just discussing it, Verity admitted. Mother mentioned the trust might be interested in acquiring it. More than interested, Thornfield clarified. Bradford included it in his initial assessment of heritage properties worth preserving in the region. He attempted to purchase it privately several times, but the current owner, a distant Carrington relative living abroad, refused all offers. I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. Yet you still have architectural plans. Bradford was nothing if not thorough, Thornfield explained. He commissioned preliminary restoration concepts for several properties in the area, operating on the assumption that the right price or circumstances would eventually make acquisition possible. He slid the folder toward us. These were completed 3 years ago by a preservation architect from Boston, but Bradford was never fully satisfied with the approach. He felt it lacked local sensitivity. Verity opened the folder cautiously, her professional interest evident despite her attempts to appear merely curious. As she examined the renderings, her expression shifted from polite interest to focused engagement. Soon she was completely absorbed, occasionally making small noises of disagreement or approval as she turned pages. The structural assessment is sound, she murmured, almost to herself. But these interior adaptations completely ignore the building's relationship to the river. And the proposed materials are all wrong for the climate here. Thornfield watched, her with barely concealed satisfaction. Precisely Bradford's concerns. He believed the project required someone with both technical expertise and a deep understanding of the region's architectural vernacular. I bit back a smile, recognizing the careful groundwork Bradford had laid, even from beyond the grave, for Verity's professional resurrection. What a fortunate coincidence that such a person might be available. Verity looked up from the plans, suddenly self-conscious as she realized how thoroughly she had revealed her professional interests. I would need to update my credentials, she cautioned. It's been years since I practiced professionally. The trust anticipates a 12 to 18-month acquisition process, Thornfield replied smoothly. More than sufficient time for licensing requirements to be addressed. In the meantime, we would value a preliminary critique of these existing plans from someone with relevant perspective. Verity hesitated, clearly tempted but still uncertain. I reached over to squeeze her hand encouragingly. You don't have to decide this minute, I reminded her. Take the plans, review them at your leisure. Consider whether this is a direction you truly want to pursue. She nodded gratefully, then carefully closed the folder. I'll give it proper consideration, she promised Thornfield, and provide some initial thoughts within the week. Excellent, he responded, clearly pleased with this outcome. Now, there is one other matter we should discuss while I'm here. His expression grew, more serious. Xavier has requested a meeting with Perseus and Calliope this weekend, at his parents' home, supervised as per the court arrangement. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Verity's posture stiffened, her momentary professional confidence replaced by maternal concern. So soon? We've barely had time to establish a routine here. He is entitled to visitation, Thornfield reminded her gently. And from a practical perspective, it may be better for the children to maintain some contact rather than experiencing a complete rupture followed by eventual court-mandated reunification. Verity sighed, rubbing her temples. You're right. Of course. It's just complex. The children miss him naturally, but they're also still processing everything that's happened. Perseus especially has questions I'm not sure how to answer. What sort of questions? I asked, concerned for my grandson's emotional well-being. Difficult ones, Verity admitted, about why Xavier kept them from you. About whether their father ever really loved me, or if our whole marriage was some kind of elaborate scheme to acquire Herondale. About what happens now that the divorce is final and Xavier's financial situation has changed so dramatically. Thornfield cleared his throat delicately. If I may offer a perspective, Bradford anticipated similar questions might arise. He left letters for both children, to be delivered when you felt the timing was appropriate. They provide his version of events, candid but age-appropriate, explaining Xavier's behavior in terms of insecurity and misplaced values rather than malice. I considered this thoughtfully. Bradford Harrington had clearly devoted considerable effort to protecting my grandchildren's relationship with their father, despite his own profound disappointment in Xavier's character. It was a level of nuance and compassion I hadn't initially attributed to the man. That might be helpful, Verity acknowledged. The children adored their great-grandfather. His perspective would carry significant weight, especially with Perseus. I'll have the letters sent over this afternoon, Thornfield promised. As for the visitation itself, perhaps it would ease your concerns to know that Xavier has been remarkably cooperative with the Trust's requirements since our initial confrontation. He's attending the specified counseling sessions, has signed all necessary legal documents without protest, and has expressed what appears to be genuine remorse for his actions, particularly regarding the children's relationship with their grandmother. Verity raised a skeptical eyebrow. Remorse? Or pragmatic acceptance of his new financial reality? Almost certainly the latter, Thornfield admitted. But the practical outcome remains the same. He no longer has the leverage or incentive to isolate the children from their maternal family. And that's what matters most, I interjected gently. Not Xavier's internal motivations, but the children's ability to maintain relationships with all their family members. Verity nodded slowly, accepting the wisdom in this approach. I'll speak with Perseus and Calliope this afternoon. Make sure they understand what to expect from the visit, and she hesitated briefly. I should probably prepare them for the changes in Xavier's circumstances. His parents' home is quite different from what they're used to. Different, but not without its own comfort and charm, Thornfield suggested diplomatically. Perhaps frame it as an opportunity to know another aspect of their heritage. After all, the Harrington family has its own traditions and history, however different from the Whitfields. I was struck again by Bradford's posthumous generosity, not just the financial provisions for his great-grandchildren, but this careful attempt to preserve their relationship with both sides of their family tree, despite the failings of their father. It reflected a wisdom I hadn't initially recognized in the elaborate trust arrangements. That's an excellent suggestion, I agreed. Children are remarkably adaptable, especially when they feel secure in their primary relationships. Our meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with Thornfield promising to send over the additional materials relating to both the Carrington property and Bradford's letters to the children. As he gathered his documents, he paused, seeming to debate whether to share one final thought. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said finally, "Bradford would have been pleased with how this has unfolded. Not just the preservation of Herondale, but the restoration of your family connections." That was always his primary concern. A concern that seems oddly personal for someone I met only once, I observed, still puzzled by Bradford's investment in our family dynamics. Thornfield hesitated, then extracted one final envelope from his briefcase. "Perhaps this will provide some context. Bradford left this letter for you personally, with instructions that it be delivered only after Herondale's future was secured, and your daughter and grandchildren had returned home." I accepted the envelope, noting the distinctive stag emblem impressed in the wax seal. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield, for everything." After he departed, Verity glanced at the unopened letter in my hands. "Aren't you going to read it?" "Later," I decided, slipping it into my pocket. "Right now, I think we should join the children in the garden. Perseus appears to be constructing some sort of water feature for the fairy village, and I suspect Calliope might appreciate some maternal reinforcement for her structural concerns." Verity laughed, linking her arm through mine as we made our way toward the garden door. Some things never change. Even as a child, Perseus was always more interested in how things could work than in whether they should work. A quality he shares with his grandfather, I noted, remembering Callum's endless experiments and innovations around Herondale. Callum once installed a rainwater collection system that was theoretically brilliant, but practically disastrous. The entire east wing smelled of damp moss for months. As we stepped into the sunlight, Perseus looked up from his project. What appeared to be an elaborate system of leaf-lined channels designed to direct water from a small handheld pitcher into various areas of the fairy garden. "Gamma, Mom. Come look," he called excitedly. "I've designed a sustainable irrigation system for the fairy crops." "Fairy crops don't need irrigation," Calliope protested, though with more resignation than genuine outrage. "They have magical growing powers, but I guess your channels look pretty," she added, with the magnanimous air of someone making a significant concession. I settled onto the stone bench nearby, watching as Verity knelt beside her children to examine Perseus's creation, offering suggestions that somehow managed to validate both his scientific approach and Calliope's more whimsical aesthetic. The scene before me, my daughter and grandchildren, engaged in creative play on Herondale's sunlit lawn, was exactly what this house had been built to contain. Family, continuity, the natural progression of generations building upon each other's foundations while adding their own unique contributions. Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into bed with promises of a boating expedition on the river the following day, I finally opened Bradford Harrington's letter in the privacy of my bedroom. The paper was heavy, expensive, the handwriting steady despite its author's advanced age. "Dear Mrs. Whitfield," it began formally, then continued in a more personal tone. "By the time you read this, you will have learned of my intervention in matters relating to your family and property. I imagine you have questions about my motivations, perhaps even suspicions about my intentions. This is entirely reasonable. From your perspective, I am virtually a stranger who has posthumously inserted himself into deeply personal family affairs. What you could not know is that Herondale has been part of my life since long before your daughter married my grandson. In the summer of 1943, when I was 14 years old, my family's Cambridge home was damaged during an electrical fire. While repairs were underway, my mother arranged for me to stay with her college roommate, Eleanor Whitfield, your husband's grandmother, at Herondale. Those 3 months changed the course of my life. Eleanor was an accomplished architectural historian who recognized and encouraged my interest in historic buildings. Each morning, we would tour some aspect of Herondale's structure, discussing the original builder's intentions, the materials used, the adaptations made by subsequent generations. In the afternoons, I was free to explore the grounds, to read in the magnificent library, to simply exist in a home that felt alive with history in a way my family's modern Boston residence never did. When I learned, decades later, that my grandson had married into the Whitfield family, the very family whose summer kindness had shaped my lifelong passion for architectural preservation, it seemed like the closing of a perfect circle. I imagined Xavier would appreciate Herondale as I had, would understand the privilege of being connected to such a legacy. I was wrong. Instead, Xavier saw Herondale merely as a status symbol, a property to be acquired rather than a legacy to be honored. When I realized he was systematically isolating your daughter and grandchildren as part of a strategy to eventually control Herondale, I knew I had to intervene. Not just for your family's sake, but for the house itself. A house that had offered shelter and inspiration to a lonely boy 80 years ago, and deserved better than to become a trophy in my grandson's collection of status symbols. I apologize for the elaborate nature of my intervention. At my age, with my health failing, direct confrontation with Xavier seemed unlikely to succeed. The trust provisions represented my best effort to ensure that both your family relationships and Herondale itself would be preserved after my death. I hope you will accept this explanation, not as justification for my intrusion into your private affairs, but as context for understanding its deeply personal motivation. Herondale gave me a vision of what a home could be, not just a building, but a repository of memory, a bridge between generations, a place where past and future coexist, in meaningful dialogue. My final wish is that it continues to serve that purpose for your family for many generations to come. With sincere respect and gratitude, Bradford Harrington. I folded the letter carefully, unexpectedly moved by this connection to my husband's family that had remained hidden for so many years. How strange to think that Bradford Harrington had walked these same halls as a boy, had perhaps sat in this very room, had formed his lifelong passions under Eleanor Whitfield's guidance. And how fitting that Herondale, which had nurtured his youthful interest in architecture and preservation, would now provide the foundation for Verity's return to that same profession. The symmetry felt right, somehow, as if the house itself had orchestrated these connections across generations and families. From down the hall came the soft sound of Verity's voice as she read a bedtime story to Calliope, who had requested just one more chapter with the time-honored persistence of children throughout history. Perseus, declaring himself too old for stories, had nevertheless positioned himself in the doorway of his sister's room, ostensibly organizing his chess pieces but clearly listening to every word. This, I reflected, was what I had nearly lost in my determination to sever ties with Herondale. Not just a historic property or a family legacy, but the living continuation of traditions and relationships that gave meaning to both. In selling the house to strangers, I would have undone connections that extended far beyond my own lifetime, connections that now included not just the Whitfield line, but the Harrington one as well. As I prepared for bed, I found myself mentally composing a letter of my own, one I would actually write tomorrow, to be preserved alongside Bradford's in the family archives. A letter to some future Whitfield or Harrington who might someday wonder about the strange series of events that had preserved Herondale as a family home, rather than allowing it to become luxury condominiums or a corporate retreat. Dear descendant, I would begin. This house once belonged to me, until I nearly lost everything that mattered by forgetting a fundamental truth, that our most valuable possessions are not the things we own, but the connections we maintain. Herondale is not just a property to be bought or sold. It is the physical embodiment of our family's continuing story. Outside my window, an owl called softly from the ancient oak that had stood sentinel beside Herondale for centuries. The sound was achingly familiar, the same nocturnal music that had accompanied generations of Whitfields to sleep in these rooms. Tonight, it seemed to carry a message of continuity, of rightness restored, of a future secure not just for the physical structure of Herondale, but for the family it was built to shelter. I drifted toward sleep with a sense of profound peace, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Xavier's visitation with the children, Verity's professional reemergence, the ongoing adjustments of our newly reunited family, we would face them together, within these sturdy walls that had weathered so many storms before. The house we had almost lost had become, once again, the home we all needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.